Good morning. So I'll start with a couple of disclosures. As Mike mentioned, I'm an industry guy. I'm CEO of a brand new company just being formed that is going to intend to develop a new device for epilepsy. And I work as a paid consultant for a bunch of different companies. Some you may recognize, some you may don't. So companies and also sort of research projects that are DARPA and NIH funded. And as you just heard, I'm a serial entrepreneur. I specialize in startup companies, and my favorite things are neurodevices, in particular neurodevices for epilepsy is really my favorite place to work. So some things we'll talk about today, and we're a small group, so I'm going to flip through some of these slides and make sure there's lots of time for us to have questions and answers. And with this size group, that shouldn't be a problem. So the things we'll touch on, we'll talk briefly about the devices that are out there, and I think most everybody here is going to know that, so I won't belabor those points. Talk about some things that I've run across that are new and in development that you may not have seen and might find kind of interesting. And then I want to save some time for that last bullet, which is I think you may be interested to hear a little bit about how the process works, how we go from idea to devices that you can actually use in clinical practice. And it turns out that's a very long winding road, and I think it's kind of dark and mysterious to a lot of people, so maybe we can shed a little light on it and make it a little less mysterious. I think I understand this may end up on YouTube or something, so I definitely want to mention that these kinds of technologies that we'll talk about, some of these are way out there. Some may never make it to market. In fact, a lot of them may never make it to market, and that is how this works. It tends to be high risk kind of development projects, and they take a long time. So sometimes I know patients' families will see these things, and we need to be calibrated and set expectations appropriately. So keep that disclaimer in mind. So, all right, let's kind of start at the top and talk about what we can do with devices. So we can do a lot of things. So we can sense and control. We can sense EEG pretty clearly. We can measure heart rate. We can look at accelerometry and temperature. We can measure neurotransmitters even. And we can process all that data algorithmically. We'll talk about that a little bit later, what that means. We can have outputs. We can stimulate neural tissues electrically. There's a ton of work going on with optical control and sensing of neural tissues. I'm not going to touch on that. We need 3 weeks to even get on the surface of that these days. It's a very, very active space. There's mechanical stimulation, ultrasound. We can change temperature. We can deliver drugs. So there's a lot of different colors you can paint with when you start thinking about devices. So some of the advantages then that devices may offer are relative to drugs. Drugs are going to necessarily affect the entire body, and depending on how they're administered, to some extent, all the time. Surgery is certainly more targeted, but it's irreversible. With devices, you've got the opportunity to deploy a therapy that's reversible. Even after it's implanted, we can adjust it. It can collect data. It can collect a lot of data about the patient, help you better manage the disease. And the ideal, and we're fair to say we have a ways to go before we are very close to this ideal, but the ideal is that you can apply therapy only when needed and only where needed. So this idea of temporal and physical locality, get it when you need it, where you need it. Most of our epilepsy patients are fine 99.9% of the time. and yet they're taking drugs all the time and suffering from the side effects of the drugs all the time. So wouldn't it be great if we could deliver therapy, know when we need to deliver therapy, and then deliver it where it's needed? So that's kind of the dream. There's a lot of challenges that come with devices, and I think that these might not be obvious to people who use devices. I know a lot of people refer to it like an implantable pulse generator as a battery, which doesn't necessarily convey the amount of things going on inside that device. But it's full of electronics and software, and there's a battery in there too, typically. And to put it in the body, that's not a very friendly place to put electronics. If you took your cell phone and dunked it in a warm bag of salt water, you wouldn't expect it to last very long. And the same is true for implantable electronics inside implantable devices. To make these things work, we have to put them inside a hermetically sealed titanium enclosure. And then we have to make sure that doesn't leak. So when we weld that enclosure shut with a laser, we put it inside a glove box that's backfilled with helium and nitrogen, and then we take it out and sniff it to see if any helium's leaking out. So those kinds of things you have to do to protect the electronics. Other issues with putting active devices in the body. So these days we'd like to be able to get data into and out of the device, and the preferred method of doing that is like we move data around all the time, which is with radio frequency signals. The frequencies that your cell phone operates at or your wireless router operate at don't propagate through the body very well. The body tends to start attenuating things above several hundred megahertz, so that's a problem for us, so we have to adapt to that. Power budget's really limited, especially with devices that are non-rechargeable. So the typical operating currents that you have to manage yourself down to are a few billionths of an amp. So tiny amounts of power. Rechargeable devices have opened that budget up quite a bit. They have to be small. They can't weigh too much. So, and that last one drives an enormous amount of work. So the expectation is these will be nearly perfect devices. These complex implantable devices are arguably some of the highest quality, most highly tested things ever built by the hands of man. They're really a lot of work goes into making these to be high quality devices. That's a huge challenge. All right, so with that in mind, let's briefly review some of the devices that are out there right now. So I think everybody's familiar with the VNS system from Leyde. Did you see that first paper, by the way? When I was researching this, I ran across that. I thought you'd appreciate that, Mike. The idea has actually been around a long time. The dates are kind of helpful, I think, to look at some of those later dates. So it was approved in 1988. We've seen some upgrades recently with the addition of the heart rate triggered VNS. So really the first one out there. And I guess this is from one of the folks here at Swedish. There's quite a growth in the number of implant procedures, and this doesn't show the replacement procedures, which are a couple times this actually. So what's nice to see from a device perspective is the trail is beginning to get blazed. There's some real work going out there, and the idea of using a device for epilepsy isn't such a foreign thought anymore. Results with the devices, as you probably all know, are modest. It can be very helpful for some patients and modestly helpful for some. Not great. Doesn't feel like a home run kind of therapy. One that's approved in Europe and getting closer in the U.S. is deep brain stimulation. Has that been in use here? Not yet. Yeah, for movement disorders, yeah. So, this was the study results were rolled out a couple of years ago now at AES, and they met endpoints with the exception of one patient who caused them a problem, had a lot of seizures right after the implant, small partial seizures, but that caused a statistical problem and led to a protracted discussion with FDA, which may be resolving itself soon. If Medtronic's announced that they're going to go back in and continue the discussion with FDA, so we'll see if this doesn't become available in the U.S. before too long. And I know that you guys are doing a lot of work with this device here, with responsive neurostimulation, this is a very interesting device in the first closed loop device. So sensing early seizure activity and stimulating. And you can see the numbers there. If we roll all these up to see how these compare, and this is kind of, do read the fine print, this is definitely an apples and oranges kind of comparison. I almost hesitated to put these on the same slide together. But we've got the standby surgery on the left, the laser approach there's next, and I do want to point out that people have been noticing that the effectiveness has been deteriorating over time. So that's very, very new data and on the early part of the learning curve there. So I'm sure lots of you have heard this, but be careful with the numbers there especially. And then we've got seizure reduction for VNS, RNS, and DBS to kind of see how they stack up. And some more numbers. I'll skip over that. So, all right. So let's talk a little bit about some emerging devices and technologies. And I'm going to pass these around. Yeah, I can pass these around. And feel free to pick these up, but maybe not tear them in half for me. So this is a lot of people who are working in epilepsy are familiar with and have handled the subdural strips and grids that routinely get placed for monitoring an EMU. And you hear a lot of comments about it'd be nice if they were thinner and more flexible and not made of hard things that don't bend like metals. And so this particular technology that I'm passing around, and feel free to handle it, is it's all polymer. It's all polymer. So an insulating polymer and a conductive polymer. This is technology that's been developed over the last 8 years with some funds from DARPA. Originally developed to make a electrode for an eye blink prosthesis. So the electrode was intended to get implanted right on the eyelid, which is a pretty delicate place to put an electrode, as you can imagine. And so the way this is built is they've got two materials. They've got a silicone polyurethane polymer, and then they've got the same polymer loaded with platinum particles. And they've got these loaded essentially into a 3D printer, a very customized 3D printer, but a 3D printer. So it's built up by a very tiny nozzle, essentially, is laying this down on a platen. And it can lay down the insulating material, and then it can lay down layers of the conductive material. And you can put multiple layers on top of each other and make a multi-layer stack up so wires can cross and not short out. And they can make features as fine, in the present incarnation, as fine as 200 microns, so pretty small. So right now, all of the electrodes we use in clinical practice are, they're like jewelry. They're little bits of platinum and little bits of exotic alloy wire, and they're put together under microscopes in a clean room, and it's very fussy, expensive kind of stuff. If you look at the way things are done in the electronics business, everything is defined with lithography. It's all photomasking and these kind of things that are more friendly to making lots of features in one step. So we're starting to see, in the interface world, we're starting to see some moves towards these more lithographic and computer-driven approaches as opposed to really skilled people on a bench under a microscope. And what I think that's really interesting is that these kinds of approaches promise to give us, more channels, smaller electrodes, be able to see higher frequency signals. And I really like this one because it's very soft and tissue friendly, customizable. So I think it's a very interesting technology. There's a lot of neural interface work going on for things like artificial retinas and things like that. But this one to me looks like it is a little closer to seeing the light of day and making it into devices. It's yet to be implanted in a person, by the way. This is still early work. So here's a brand new one. And I don't know if you guys have heard this news or not, but this is from Dr. Mark Cook in Melbourne, Australia, who is someone we worked with closely at the previous company, Neurovista. And Mark has been working with a company out of Colorado that's studying the use of pumps to deliver drugs. And they've got a bunch of news articles on this, and they've shared with me some of the video interviews with the patient, this first patient. So this patient was having multiple seizures a week. The epilepsy was really deteriorating, and they were really running out of options. And so they decided to enroll as the first subject in this study. And they've got the pump in. It's been in for about a month now, and I talked to Mark last week about this, and no seizures to date. So the patient's been seizure free. So this is about as early as you can get in terms of results, and I can't imagine that things aren't going to change over time, but it's certainly an interesting first result, and I think also interesting in that a lot of the parts of the system were relatively conventional device technology. So this is, I recommend keeping an eye on this one. Which site? In Melbourne, Australia at St. Vincent's. Oh, so they, I don't think I have a diagram of this, but I think it's kind of a subclavicular location, and they route the plumbing up near the focus. There's a couple of words about the study design. So they've been cleared for quite a few patients, and I think there's they won't say what, but there's 4 different compounds I think they're studying or have clearance to study as part of this. All right, so we talked about VNS that we're all using today, but I think this device is kind of interesting. So this is from a company that's developing a VNS device for autoimmune disorders. In particular, they're studying right now for rheumatoid arthritis. And so there's been a lot of research showing that you can modulate anti-inflammatory response by operating with a VNS device. And so what this device does, instead of having an implanted device and a lead tunneled up and a little spiral electrode put on the nerve, it's an all-in-one device. So here's this very tiny ceramic body with electrodes on the end. You can see it relative to a dime here, and it gets implanted, and then it gets energized with a device you wear around the neck, and that makes an electromagnetic field that powers up the device. It's a really tiny device, no leads to break. The electronics are being made over in Redmond, by the way. There's a trend in devices and neuro devices in general. Now that Moore's law has been operating a long time and everything's getting smaller, that we can start to consider this kind of device architecture. And I'm seeing more devices like this out there. There's pacemakers now that look kind of like this. There's cardiac recorders that look kind of like this. I think this is one of the first neuro devices that has this kind of form factor. So RNS has paved the way on closed loop therapies for epilepsy, but DBS is starting to head that way too. So there's a research platform that's now available that is on its second generation that includes a multi-channel EEG amplifier and a lot of onboard processing for EEG processing at really low, amazingly low power levels. And it's all that electronics is running essentially piggyback on a standard DBS therapy device and being made available to researchers. So this is now in research with a number of groups around the world. A lot of this is being funded by Brain Initiative grants, and it's going to be interesting to see if this can be used to improve the performance of open loop DBS. All right, here's one that's kind of close to my heart, and we have the founder of the company actually with us here, Dr. DiLorenzo. So he's going to correct me if I get anything wrong.
Sure, you'll do it all right.
So, and you may or may not have seen this device system before. This was a device system that was built and studied to demonstrate the feasibility of predicting seizures. This has been shown, there's been a lot of material shown at AES the past few years on this, so you may have seen it there, but the idea is that we've got subdural strips. We've got a device here that collects the data, amplifies it, digitizes it, transmits it out to a handheld device. The handheld device is running a pretty sophisticated algorithm that looks for signs in the EEG that indicates that you're at high risk of having a seizure soon. That's the idea behind the device. I wanted to add a couple. This algorithm thing can be kind of mysterious, so I wanted to just briefly discuss that. This is actually from a slide I showed in Swedish about 10 years ago. So this is obviously a toy problem, but what computer algorithms do typically is they you can kind of divide them into collections of feature extractors and classifiers. Feature extraction is the step where we quantify some aspect of the incoming data. If it's EEG coming in, we might say how much energy is in a certain band, or how chaotic does it appear, or find some way of quantifying some aspect of the data. In this toy problem I put up here, we've got two feature extractors, and we're feeding in data from a picture of a zebra. We're looking at how stripy does this animal look. It says 92%, so features are imperfect. They give you a number, but it's going to be noisy and bounce around. And it's got a leg counter. It's counted 4 legs. That's feature extraction. We quantify the data in some way. And then the next step is we classify. So classifications, we look at this quantified parameters coming our way, and we make a decision based on those parameters. And ideally, we look at each of the features and combine all those things together to come up with what we hope is the right answer. In this case, we're thresholding at 80% stripes and greater than 3 legs. And if that's true, we're going to call it a zebra, and we got the right answer. If I showed it a picture of a horse, it'd say not many stripes on that horse, and say not zebra. And hopefully we get the right answer. I used to have another slide where I showed it a picture of a tiger. As well, 4 legs and stripes must be a zebra, so it's getting the wrong answer. And that's the algorithm game, is you keep adding and changing your features and working on your classifier to try to make it get the right answers. And that's what was inside that little handheld device that we produced at NeuroVista. We processed time and frequency domain, extracted time and frequency domain features from the EEG, and ran into a classifier which looked at all the combination of inputs, and then would deliver an answer to say, I think you're not going to have a seizure, or I think you are going to have a seizure. And this was our star patient. Here's the paper from Lancet Neurology that this is pulled from, but each of these rows represents 24 hours of output from the device. So midnight to midnight, And then if it's blue, it indicates the little handheld device had a blue light illuminated saying, I don't think they're going to have a seizure. If you see a red color, it indicates that the red light was on saying, I think they're going to have a seizure. That's what the device was reporting to the study subject. The little lightning bolts here are annotation markers indicating when the patient actually had the seizure. And this is really compressed, so it's a little hard to tell, but in each case, the red light's coming on well ahead of the seizure, the actionable amount of time, more than 15 minutes typically. And the patient's enjoying long periods of time where they know that they're not at risk of seizure. So it's a very interesting result. Another aspect of this device, and I think is also becoming more and more interesting aspect of the RNS device, is the ability to collect these really long data records. So this is output of a feature that's responding to spikes on one of the electrodes implanted in this study subject. And the red lines are when a seizure occurred. And this x-axis is days. We're out to 60 days out here. So you're looking at 60 continuous days of recording. And here's this gigantic pattern, which, by the way, we did not use in any of our seizure prediction algorithms. This was a new discovery, and I don't think anybody's acted on this in a useful way yet. But, it's hard to say that these seizures are not related to this background process. You can see after a series of seizures, the spike rate starts declining down to some rate, and then seizures begin again. And that was really interesting when we saw it. What was really even more interesting was, now here's 150 days of processed data, and you can see it just keeps right on going. So this is, I think, it may be an underappreciated aspect of the potential value for devices, is the ability to get these really long records. I think it's going to help us learn more about the disease and how the disease works, and lead to improvements in how we manage patients and how we treat patients. And I'm excited that to see some of the work going on with the RNS device, and it's neat to see this new DBS research device also that's capable of collecting data. So I think that's an important trend, and I look forward to seeing all the papers and research that's going to come out of that. Okay, so we'll change gears a little bit here and talk a little bit about factors that impact our ability to bring new devices to market. So this is, I'm going to try to, as I mentioned, try to make the business of going from idea to marketable device a little less mysterious. Let's see how well I do with that. So some of the rate limiting factors on going from ideas to devices are, do we know what we need to make? Can we make it? And then can we fund it? And let's talk about each one of those. So do we know what we need to make? So right now the answer is not so much in epilepsy. So it's clearly not a one-size-fits-all problem. It's really complicated and highly dimensional. Every patient is different, and there's a lot going on at very fine levels, and a lot going on at less fine levels. So it's a complicated space. I can't, in terms of a definitive device therapy, I don't think anyone can answer, could fill this sentence out and say, if we stimulate here, or cool this, or do this, or operate here at this location, this patient's going to stop having seizures. There's a lot of things where you can say, if I make this car with this big engine, it's going to use this much gas, or it's down to math, and they can understand it. We're not there. We're not close to there with epilepsy. Another one I wanted to mention that might not be as obvious to you guys, but I'm sure you've all used devices that you thought, now, who were the guys making this device? They got this wrong. This is clumsy. But engineers design these devices like me, and we're not always smart as we think we are, believe it or not. Don't remind us too often. But we really benefit from our interactions with clinicians, and that's one reason I was happy to come out and talk with you guys today. It's important for us to get out of our silos and interact. You guys can have a lot to do with helping us make sure the next generation of devices makes sense and works for you and your patients. So we appreciate the interaction. So that next rate limiting factor, can it be made? So I'm going to boldly assert that we can make anything today. Technology's gotten amazing. We can make incredibly small things. Your cell phone is an amazing device. 20 years ago, I wouldn't say that. 20 years before that, I definitely wouldn't say that. The first pacemakers were based on a piano metronome. They were pretty simple devices. The devices we can make today are unbelievably complex, and it's amazing what we can fit in tiny, tiny little space and use almost no power with enough resources. And that's really the key. So we can do things now that are nearly magic if we have the resources. Let me back up. So what's enough resources? So one of my clients is Galvani. I don't know if you guys have heard of this company. It's a joint venture of GSK and Verily, which is Google's life sciences company. So GSK and Google, they've pledged $750 million to this program, which seems like I have a hard time comprehending that number. It seems like such a huge number. That must be enough resources, right? That's a huge amount of money. But maybe it's not as much as we think. So this is something you can get off the web yourself if you're interested in take a look. It's a site called PitchBook. They track venture funding. For a subscription, you can have those numbers be not foggy and get the details. But this is the preview. And this happens to be a funding history for NeuroPace. And here's the start in 1997. And it starts with a Series A, and PitchBook must not have had all their data together because all of a sudden it jumps up to Series F. So we kind of left out B, C, D, E, and so forth on the way up to F. And then it keeps on going, and they got tired of adding letters because after a while that doesn't look very good for your company, I guess. So they went back to Series A and kind of flattened things out, and that's fairly recent. And according to PitchBook, anyways, they're up to around $250 million. So I know the NeuroPace. I know members of the NeuroPace team and known them for a long time. Frank Fisher was on our board at a company I worked at back in the 1990s, and I've known them since then. They're a fabulous team, and I've stayed in touch with them all this time, and they're great guys, and I really appreciate what they've done. I think they've really blazed a lot of trails for us, but it just shows you how big these programs are, and how, that $750 million number maybe doesn't seem like an infinite amount of resources when you see a program like this consume a third of that. So I think it's useful to think about how did that money get spent? Where did that $250 million go? And I was trying to think how to explain this. And an old kids cartoon popped in my head. You guys remember Schoolhouse Rock and how a bill becomes a law? That they have a little animated cartoon and song. Anyways, I can't sing, and I'm not going to do a cartoon, but we'll talk about how ideas go and become devices. So this is maybe kind of an idealized sequence of financings of activities. So early on, you have an idea. Then you put a core team together and you make big plans. So somebody just gave me a picture recently of me and Dr. DiLorenzo and John Harris getting together at someone's house with a PowerPoint and a couple of beers trying to dream up ideas. And that was 2004, I think. And that's how these things start, is you get together and hopefully somebody's got a good idea and there's maybe some patents around the table and things like that. Then you have to go out and raise money. And initially, you might seek something like $5 or $10 million, maybe enough to get some early clinical data, maybe something in the OR, maybe some animal work or something like that. And you're probably going to spend a couple of years doing that. And next up, you say, well, we'd really like to do a bigger study with 15 or 20 patients. Now you need to raise something like $20 or $40 million. That's going to take 2 or 3 years to get that work done. Then you're going to say, well, let's start heading for a PMA. Well, that's a big effort. You have to have a lot of discussions with FDA. You've got to make a really complex device that's super well controlled. You're going to hire a big team and write a lot of paychecks, and maybe that's going to be another $30 to $60 million. And then eventually, if things go well, you make it to product launch. So you can this is an ideal. We don't see a Series I or Series G here. If things get tough along the way, and epilepsy is tough, you're probably going to go slower and spend more money. And that's how you make it up to those big numbers. So when we talk to investors about, I've got this idea and I want to build a company around it, they're performing their own calculus. So on one side of the balance, they see that, okay, 1% of the population has epilepsy and 30% of these patients are refractory to meds. And they want solutions. So clearly there's a large unmet need, and we could, if we come up with something that really helps these patients, it stands to be a large business. Okay, that part sounds good. But on the other side of the scale, they're saying, oh, this is going to take a lot of money. I'm not going to find out if it works until I've done studies way down the road, years from now. And when I do it, insurance isn't going to want to pay me. So from a business perspective, I'm going to have to fight it out with people for a long time to make sure I get paid. So there's a lot of things that are pretty tough. And this is the calculus that an investor is going to consider before they'll make an investment in your new idea for a new epilepsy device. So that sounds, I think, a little bit pessimistic, but I wanted to mention why I'm actually fairly bullish on the thought that we're going to see big improvements in epilepsy devices over time. So technology does follow a curve. There is early, mid, and mature phases. We're pretty clearly up here in early. I use airplanes as an analogy, but early on, it's hit and miss. We really don't understand the underlying principles. People didn't understand lift and drag in airfoils. When the Wright brothers came along, they started figuring it out. They built wind tunnels. They measured lift and drag. They started using math in designing. And it worked, and they made a ton of progress. And by the way, these were not super highly capitalized people. It was a couple of bike makers working nights and taking vacation out to the beach to fly their airplanes. So that's the mid stage. But look what happened afterwards. When we learned how things worked, when we started to understand things more quantitatively and less qualitatively, it just exploded, and now we consider it routine to be flying around the planet in airplanes all the time. It's not a big deal. So this is an interesting, this is certainly an interesting area in the evolution of technologies. We're kind of somewhere in there now. We've got, a number of devices out on the market that are blazing the trail, that are starting to knock the barriers down, that are improving our understanding of disease, and we've got Moore's Law coming up along behind us, making it possible to do more and more things that we might like to do. So those things are starting to mix together. There's business being done in the space. All these things are going to help us move down this curve, and that's what I think we're going to see devices eventually that make a big difference in epilepsy. So that's what I've got. Any questions or